Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the podcast where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, Rebecca Ikes Kara. Welcome back, my friends. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm saying it, but we are now officially in season 3 of the Maker's Playbook podcast. At least for those of you listening along live as each episode is dropped. If you're binging, you know this really doesn't matter. But for me, it's a big deal. I think you are all probably going to roll your eyes at me when I say how freaking excited I am for some of these upcoming interviews. Because I realize that I say that just about every time, but it's no lie. I am feeling awfully spoiled on this side of the microphone to have these conversations because frankly, selfishly, half the time, I'm asking the questions I'm curious about for myself as Francesco and I embark on starting and growing our own pottery business. Obviously, I love it when you email me with your suggestions, and so many of you have done that over the last few weeks as we took this season break. So keep them coming, my friends. The email is podcast@makers-playbook.com to send in your requests for other artists to be interviewed or topics you want to hear discussed. But today's conversation is one that really helped shed a lot of light on a lot of big subjects that I've had questions about for me personally. If you stick with us for the full episode, you're going to hear me get vulnerable on my struggle with finding that ever elusive style with a capital S, and also get some real tactical examples on how full-time studio potters with 2 kiddos made life work when offered a residency that you just couldn't turn down. Not to mention a couple of transatlantic, halfway across the world moves. You know, no big deal. So who is it sharing all of these nuggets of wisdom and insights? Well, today I'm chatting with the one and only Adam Field. So let's dig in. Hey, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making the time. And before I get too far into it, I feel like I never have a good way to start out these conversations, but for people to have context for who the heck I'm talking to, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, my name is Adam Field. I'm a potter. I live in Helena, Montana, where I am a full-time potter and full-time everything else that goes with that, all the hats. I've been in my studio in Helena since I moved here in 2013 from Colorado is my home state.
Now, I think a lot of potters out there know Helena as a clear mecca, feels like a big word to use, but kind of a no-brainer for someone who's in this craft. Was that the drawing point to come to Helena in the first place, or did you come out there for a different reason, or what was the impetus of the move?
Yeah, that's what brought me here. I was really fortunate to get a residency position at the Archie Bray Foundation. That was a summer residency in 2013. Then that transitioned into a 2-year long-term residency. And by the time that wrapped up, you know, the kids had kind of dug their roots in with friends in school, and Helena was feeling like a pretty good place to stick around. So here we are. However many years later now, 8 years almost.
I was just going to say what year. I almost said 7 because in my brain I was thinking of 2020, but no, it's 2022 now. So, yep.
The time warp of COVID.
No, seriously. So this brings up a totally different subject that I would love to dive down that I didn't even know about. I'm fascinated by residencies, and I think it's such a fruitful way for those of us as makers and craftspeople and artists to grow. But I also have this stereotype that it's only possible to work for the 20-something undergrad out of school before you have roots, before you have kids, to make it logistically work. So I would love to dive in a little bit into how you guys manage that.
Yeah, we were oddball residents, I would say. I mean, and the Bray is really good about not having a necessarily standard resident there, but I do think you're right. There is that window of time where people aren't so tethered to a certain place and all of the things that can kind of hold us down to a place in life. And, you know, with the thought of a residency, it was like, well, we can make it work because it's a summer thing. The kids are out of school and we subleased our rental in Durango where we were living to some friends. And it was like, okay, this is all manageable. We can do it. And it's the Archie Bray Foundation, and you don't pass up that opportunity. You apply, even though it doesn't make sense. That's what I would tell everybody is, have you applied to any of these residencies? Like, well, no, it's the Bray. I don't know. That's a reality. And it's, well, definitely not a reality if you haven't put an application in.
The answer is no if you don't ask.
That's how you guarantee it, and I've definitely encouraged people to put an application in, and they're like, well, yeah, I don't know that it would work for me. It's, well, once you get accepted, you'll figure out that you need to make it work. That's kind of how we did it. We were fortunate to have some support from family that had our kids spending time with grandma and aunts and uncles and cousins down in Denver for part of that summer. But otherwise, it was just kind of splitting time. And when I say we, my now ex-wife, Hisu Lee, a lot of people I'd say listening are aware of her work. She really has been making some really amazing work. So we were trying to figure out with one application that we applied on how we could both kind of make use of the time and space that we had at the residency. And you're right. I mean, to take it back to the original question, we were not necessarily the usual residents there. There were a lot of people that were fresh out of school and kind of taking that next step on the resume building path, working towards maybe a teaching job or full-time studio practice. And yeah, I think one of the big things that I took away from that experience, I had been a studio potter full-time for about 12 years ahead of that. And all of a sudden I would find myself in the summer studio with 9 other studios around, and there aren't walls between those studio spaces.
You thought you wanted coworkers, but
yeah, it's like all of these eyeballs in the room, and I got a little bit paralyzed by that. I felt like really self-conscious. I feel like growth for me, and I think most people in anything that they do, requires a bit of vulnerability and taking those steps outside of what we're comfortable with. And so to do that in front of this amazing group of artists that are in the same room felt intimidating to me. But, one of the things that the Archie Bray, one of the many things that it's great for is the fact that they allow residents access to the workshops that run during the summer, if there's enough room and space. And so I found myself spending a good bit of time in those workshops. And the setting for a workshop is, this is a safe place to try new things. And that felt great. And it was like, okay, here, of all of the different things happening on this campus, here is a place that feels safe to me. And I don't know, I really do think of myself as this lifelong student. And so I was really thriving in that aspect of the residency. With the stipend that came along with the residency, it was this great opportunity to kind of back off a little bit on the breakneck production pace that was happening outside of the residency and be, okay, I have an opportunity now to try some different things. It was extremely valuable in that way.
Man, that's amazing. I guess I've always assumed most of the residencies I hear about are kind of time trade for experience, to where you don't necessarily have the financial support, which totally understand as a self-employed artist. Like, we all have pretty relatively meager business setups or whatnot. But at the same time, that's a very niche group of people who can figure out how to make that work logistically. Thank you for just mentioning that, because it's just, the logistics are part of what I'm interested in these conversations. Because I think also, just to reiterate, you were doing it with 2 kids, and how old were they at the time?
They were pretty young. I want to say my daughter was coming up on 4 and my son was 9 years old.
I just love to have that example, because I've gotten messages from people, hey, can you interview somebody who has kids? And it's like, oh, well, Simon has kids or Sandy Lockwood has kids. And it's not clear that this is happening, because so much of, the Instagram world out there is
doesn't include that necessarily. It's the facet of the business side of it, or studio side, which doesn't always include that. Plus now, like, my kids are at an age where they're like, if I want to take a picture of us on vacation or something like that, they're like, don't post it. I'm like, all right.
But you're great content, kids. Come on.
I'm like, well, all right, at least I'll text it to grandma and everybody. And We get at least 4 or 5 likes from
That's why Apple came up with the reactions in group
Right.
text for
Yeah,
that
yeah.
very for that very reason. That's amazing. Well, so what did you extended and had the 2-year time, and then what did that transition out look like as far as getting set
Yeah.
up and what life is like now?
Yeah, logistically, it was a little bit tricky because Hisu and I had applied on one application for what was going to be one studio spot in the summer residency.
Because you guys collaborated, like worked full time together.
No, it's just because we were coming in as a couple, that was kind of recommended as the way to apply. I mean, it's hard enough to get in. And so if we're on one application, then we're, more likely to get that, I think, than applying separately. And plus, just with us kind of switching with childcare and everything, it just made sense. But
that makes sense.
There was somebody who was not able to make it last minute. And so a second studio space for us opened up in the summer studio. And that all worked out really well to have our own spaces.
Isn't it funny? I'm going to interrupt for just a second. It's just one of those reminders how we all think we have to plan it all out so perfectly. And it's like, actually, it worked out better than had you both independently applied. Who knows what would have happened?
Right. And so then the opportunity to move from that one initial application into a longer term spot came up. The way that the long term spots residencies are structured, it's not something that generally gets shared. And so then it was like, okay, we need to make a decision here. And initially thought for a few logistical reasons, it made sense for me to take the first year and then she was going to take the second year. But then that felt like not the full experience. And then we made the realization, well, why doesn't she just apply for her own separate one for that second year? So essentially between the two of us, we each did 2 years with one overlap year in the middle, which was crazy because the full-time residency there keeps you busy. So anyways, it was the stretch of 3 years total plus the summer. The transition was interesting because, when I finished my 2 years, she was in there for one more year. And so I moved my studio from the Bray, which is an interesting experience because that is kind of the pinnacle experience in terms of academia and these kind of formalized experiences in Clay. And then to go from that to the garage/basement studio again is, kind of latch on to what I know in Clay and what I know from 12 years of being a full-time potter. And that's so interesting. I've been doing some teaching, which I'm sure we'll get into later in this conversation a little more in depth. But so much of what I've been focusing on is that the practice of being a potter for me has really evolved from something that was about making an object to something that is the experience and time that I spend making that object. And if I'm really focused on making something that is this end product object that is so much of what it's about, and then I sell it and it's gone from my life, then that to me started to really feel like a setup for disappointment. And the conversation I had actually with my current assistant as recent as last night was, he's very music oriented. He's a great musician. And so I said, I have him throwing some cylinders as practice. And we cut him in half, to really dissect. And he's like, that seems like a lot of work to have these cut in half. And my response to that was, well, okay, what do you have to walk away from when you finished playing a song on your guitar that you did not record? And it's the joy of singing that song and performing it on the instrument and knowing that every time you perform it, it's a different experience and it's enjoyable and it's not necessarily about something. And I did an apprenticeship some years earlier than the residency, and I made 500 large jars that 498 of them got cut in half.
That's going to pain so many people to hear, but how else do you improve though, right?
Right. And this is about the act of making pots and how I relate to that.
It's interesting to me, his hesitation on cutting them in half, because I started my undergrad as a music performance major. And as I started learning pottery, to me, the act of cutting things in half, or even how I found myself naturally drawn to repeat throwing because of the way I was trained as a musician, right? Any private instructor I had, we didn't practice the music I was playing in an orchestra. We practiced single line techniques and scales and arpeggios and all of these other things, which to me is like throwing 2-minute cylinders and cutting them all in half for 5 hours.
Yeah. And when I found myself outside of the residency, it went back to, actually all of those things that are the studio, the facilities, that can change at any point. But what I carry with me is the sum of the experiences. And that shift of perspective has been something really valuable for me in my studio practice.
It sounds more mentally sustainable also, like to be able to detach. Because I think the thing I've had to learn over the years with selling photography and selling whatever services in that way, you have to kind of grow a thick skin of when people choose to hire somebody else and not choose you, even though it feels personal, that it actually really isn't all that personal for the people on the other side making the decision. In the same way, selling pottery is, if you're so attached to the piece and then somebody says, oh, it's that much money, or has some kind of negative reaction, it's like little paper cuts to your heart.
Well, or the opposite. Oh yeah, that's great. I'll take it. And then if you're really attached to the piece, because really best case scenario, everything that we make is gone from our lives because somebody buys it. And when I transitioned out of school, that was a hard thing because those pots that I really loved were kind of few and far between. And to see those go and be like, oh, I'm never going to see that piece again was difficult for a while. But then it was like, but all of those things that I loved about it are things now that I know I want in the work that I make in the future.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm fascinated by is you had 12 years of studio. You were full-time studio potter before the Bray also, right?
Yeah. So I made my first pots in 97 and then came to the Bray in 2012. So I was wrong about that a little bit. That was 16 years. And I think that the 12 years was my residency in Korea.
And how did you first get into it? Where did you start in 97? Was that with any kind of program or just kind of fell into it?
To go even farther back to when I was in 5th grade, had a great elementary school art teacher. And within my district, I grew up just outside of Denver in the suburbs there. There was something where they would kind of select certain students to go to an art camp up in the mountains. And I was not selected for that. But my older siblings were.
Not that this is a point of contention still at all.
not that I think about it every day or anything like that. No, fortunately had a good advocate in my mother who, when I was in 5th grade, said, hey, how about that art camp? He'd like to go, kind of thing. And so it was amazing. We went from what was a really good elementary school art program, but still elementary school art, to this camp that was just a week long. But I did darkroom photography, I did stone sculpture, I did small metal jewelry. From what I see from my perspective now, it was like college level, like studio art classes. Amazing.
Absolutely. I was making paper mache in elementary school art.
Yeah. And so really got hooked on the whole darkroom photography thing. And fortunately, my middle school and high school both had great darkroom photography programs. And so that was really kind of the path that I thought I was going to go career-wise, and into college until I needed to round out those elective classes as I approached graduation. And that darn pottery class that was always full, finally I had first crack at registration as an upperclassman and took that, thought I would get a little better GPA and do that fun pottery thing. But the teacher was actually like very structured and he was not having it. And unfortunately, in that time, there were a group of us, maybe 4 or 5 of us in the class, and most of the others had had quite a bit more experience going back years, middle school, high school. And it was kind of a really friendly competition thing that was happening. And between the 4 of us, at the end of the semester, you'd have to lay your pots out in the hallway. And it was yards upon yards of pots that we had laid out because it was just making tons of pots. So That was that first part of the transition. And I always talk about with this how the darkroom was shifting to the hard drive at that time, late 90s. And I found myself sitting in front of a computer waiting for filters to render. Whereas before I had my hands in the process and then all of a sudden jumped into clay and it was like, oh, I can actually turn this cylinder into a bowl.
It's exactly why I picked up
Yeah.
pottery again. It's
Yeah.
I was like, okay, cool. I'm on a very good trajectory here then. All right.
Yeah. Yes, that was the start of it for me. And I went to school in Durango, and there was a potter who owned a gallery and had his studio underneath it. And I got to talking with him one day, and he said, yeah, if you're ever interested in throwing pieces production, I always need people to help with that. And instead of going home for that summer, ended up sticking around the college town and throwing pots for him and threw 600 of these tiny little cups. And magically, when I came back for my senior year of college, you know, those bigger pots were so much easier to throw from
Funny
all
how
that
that works.
experience. Yeah. After that, I moved to San Francisco after I graduated, and I worked at a ceramic supply store there for about a year and a half. And talk about a good education, because the phone was ringing constantly and people wanted answers. And so I really had to educate myself through my coworkers, but also my boss at the time set aside $500 a year for his employees to take workshops. And then that kind of became the way that I continued my education for making.
So if you had to summarize, do you feel like there has been any big shifts or turning points as far as how you've been able to have this trajectory and decades of making it work as a studio potter?
Yeah, I think that it served me well to kind of follow my interest. And with having the photo background, as things like smartphones have come along, I was finally able to jump back in. And whereas before it was a dark room, now we all have it in our pocket, and figuring out how I could get back into that and plug it into my practice. There was a moment, I was on a social media panel at NCECA a number of years ago, and somebody had the question during the Q&A, how much time do you spend doing things like social media, computer time versus making? And I was like flat out honest about it. Is 50-50 is probably not totally accurate. And that's not because I'm making more pottery than doing the other.
Yeah.
And a few weeks later, somebody sent me a link, and oh man, whoever that was that asked that question, they kind of blasted you on their blog. I think the person was very much like a traditionalist. And if you're going to be a potter, you sit down at the wheel for however many hours a day and you crank out the pots and the sales will come. And, you know, I just had to think about that a little bit. I don't really draw much of a line between producing content, if we want to call it that, in the terms of social media, and making pots. It is a type of artistic expression for me. And so I think having some flexibility and not being so rigid in those ways, and carrying that through to what types of pots that I make, and having some fluidity in what my market, what my audience is. I think that people can get pretty rigid about, here's who I want to sell to, and it's blinders otherwise. And I think it's been really helpful for me to not be so rigid about that and say, well, let's not discount this market, because at the end of the day, as much as I want to have my ideals, I also want to be able to support this practice. And if I'm too rigid, then it's like I've limited the income that can help me to continue with this career path.
And that's exactly the impetus of how I even found myself starting this podcast, was looking at Instagram going, okay, but how does this work for people, right? Because I've been self-employed for a decade at that point, and I know how difficult it is. And I was seeing all these people post these shop updates after shop updates and thinking, okay, but your cost of materials and your shipping and your, you know, like there's got to be some things that we're not seeing here of how this actually works. You mentioned audience fluidity. I mean, I'm sure things have changed with the advent of smartphones and social media. So has there kind of been a trajectory of how you used to sell your work to now?
Yeah, I think about my grandparents and great grandparents and how they saw like no motorized vehicles to whatever was happening within the last 25 years. What a big change for them. And that had me then thinking like, well, what in my lifetime, and at least within my career, I can't really think of early on many examples of somebody not experiencing a piece in person before buying it. And that has completely changed now to where the opposite is true. It's very rare for somebody to actually see a piece and handle it before purchasing it. And so all of the different iterations in between, some of my first sales were going to the student union building in college because we had all those pots that filled that hallway. And it's like, all right, we can rent a table during the lunch hour and turn these pots into money. And so I think that was definitely the first time where I was like, oh, that was really cool for me to have this thing that allowed for conversation with these people that I see all the time around campus, but don't ever talk to. And just through having something for sale, you find this middle ground where it's okay, maybe the way we dressed or whatever, just social constructs on campus, or we were different majors or whatever. But then you have this thing that is a different cross section, like pottery. Everybody needs a plate or a bowl or a cup to eat from, drink from. And so then that transitioned after a while into selling at farmers markets. And again, you could really cut through a different cross section. I really enjoy those, but they're extremely exhausting to go and set up and break down. And especially when it's pottery and you're looking over at the jeweler across the aisle and they're folding up 5 suitcases / display cases and heading out, in
their little roller bag, like
10 minutes.
To do.
Yeah. And I'm like bringing shelving down and all of these fragile pots and all this. But I mean, that was a hard lesson for me to learn. So after San Francisco, I visited some friends from college who were from Hawaii and saw that like cost of living in the San Francisco Bay Area was not so far off from amazing Maui. And I was living in West Berkeley, so pretty industrial on the train tracks and spending a lot of money doing it. It was like, this is so much more fulfilling to see paradise in the tropics to the work. And so it was not too much longer after that. I ended up moving out there. And seasonally, you could do farmers markets kind of year round. And so that was the starting point. And the great thing about Hawaii was that there was a steady flow of tourists coming through and they wanted to bring something home to remember their trip by. And so I really think of my time in Hawaii as a time to figure out what it was to have a conversation about the work that felt comfortable and also in a way that didn't feel kind of slimy, steer that conversation towards turning pottery into a paycheck. The way that the sales landscape was in Hawaii for art, the farmers markets and art fairs were kind of at the bottom end of that. And then the goal to work towards was the Four Seasons Resort they still have it actually, an artist program. And we would go down and set up a table 50 weeks out of the year. So same day of the week.
Wow.
And it was a group of 7 artists per day that were non-competing, but it was a different group each day of the week. So it was like maximized for income for the hotel. It was a big program.
Yeah.
And being the Four Seasons, it was very much pre-qualified clientele. And we were between the elevators and the pool or restaurants or spa, and made it really easy if somebody was walking by in their bathing suit and didn't have their wallet. All sales went through
charge it to the room.
The logo store, charge it to the room. Oh, and if you have a FedEx account, you can give me that number. You'll get your discount on shipping. And it was crazy. Between myself and my then wife, we were breaking into 6 figures in selling pottery.
Which is probably like a very small percentage of people in the history of pottery to be able to do.
It's crazy, Granted, like the bigger picture on this was pre-2008 economy crash. And everybody was out there on their bonus trips because they were investment bankers. And so
it's like right place, right time.
Yeah. And it all came together. But, the great thing, like I said about that, is I was able to figure out what felt comfortable to me in talking about my work. And it went from, I really need to figure out how to sell these people my work. It went from that, which I thought it was in the first place, to these people really want something special to bring home, and not just something that is like a trinket from the import shop down the road, but something that's made here that is meaningful. And I really started to see that I have this knowledge that these people, in a way, they have the money. There's no question. They're already at the Four Seasons. So they just want somebody with authority on the subject to say, hey, this is actually a really quality something that you want to remember your trip by. And then some of the sales technique comes in. And if you have like a house sitter or a pet sitter, they really appreciate this stuff too. And then it comes in, oh yeah, we should get that. And and by the way, for this person. And
also for grandma. Yep.
Yeah, like upsell was where I learned that. Yep. And again, it feels like, in a way, kind of this dirty word, but actually it was doing everybody a favor.
This is the thing that I think about sales that gets such a bad rep is it's only slimy if you're trying to sell something you don't actually believe in.
That's right.
If you're trying to sell something you're not proud of, then go sell used cars. But if you're proud of it, and if you know the quality's good, and if you know the price reflects that, I sell a lot of my revenue in wedding albums. And they are exponentially more expensive than Shutterfly. But I believe in my bones that someone's going to pick up that box in 80 years and open it up and be able to learn about their family history. It gives me goosebumps talking about it when I'm talking about pottery. And I genuinely believe that. And therefore I sell a lot of them.
Yep.
And I'm not like screwing anybody over. No, absolutely. The messages and stuff you get from people, like it's crazy.
Yeah. And so what would come from that also as like a parallel experience of going from this ridiculous paradise of a high-end hotel to the other side of the island and being, not the fanciest of studios and getting bit by mosquitoes while I'm trying to work and all that was so interesting, the kind of differences between the two. But to what you were just mentioning, if what I was talking about in selling the work, if I realized in doing that, that's actually not in alignment with how I feel about it. And then it would have this internal dialogue of, okay, well, then how do I change what I'm making to fit with how I talk about it or how I feel about it, or vice versa? Maybe I need to change how I'm talking about it. But it was this great practice of really honing in on why I'm making the work that I make and having to articulate that to many people on a weekly basis was just a great learning experience. I felt like I learned a lot about sales and kind of took some of that stigma away from it during that time as well.
That's also a fascinating, like you were practicing every single day.
It was like production throwing, but for selling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I know over the course of the last decade that there is such a learning curve to sales.
Yep.
And so being able to practice like that and think about why you're saying what you're saying over and over again, I don't know where else you could get a master class in sales like that, aside from having to work retail as a kid or something like that. But then you're not invested in it. It's not the same.
Right. Yeah. It's not you sitting there selling your own stuff.
Right. Oh man, I'm not going to dive down all that much further. But one thing I am curious about with that, because it's an interesting through line that I'm hearing you talk about, always asking the question of why you're making what you're making. Like in Hawaii, it was a question around the sales. And when we first started Shopking, it was a matter of, connecting to the act of making and not the act of the finished product. But I wonder, specific to the time in Hawaii, I am sure there was pressure in the beginning before you got into the Four Seasons to make the popular stuff, right?
Oh yeah, dolphins, humpback whales, turtles.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, big time.
And one thing everybody across the board I've talked to has reiterated over and over again, whether they're side hustling their pots or full time, has been to make what you love and make what you like. And I wonder what that pressure was like to deal with in a place as expensive to live in as Hawaii, to keep your style. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you made a bunch of dolphins for a while. I don't know.
It's something that I picked up on working at the ceramic supply store in San Francisco right after graduating from school was observing the people that came through the doors because they were the ones who had made a career of it. I was still getting my toes wet because I hadn't committed, I still had a real job. And I started to notice this correlation between people's disposition and what they were making and why. And so there was this person who would get tons and tons of clay to make thousands and thousands of trinket items because they had learned to do that early on and they realized they could make money from it, and then they were off to the races. And then there would be generally these older clients that would come in, these customers, and they had really stuck to their guns and they had continued to learn different techniques. I would see them in those workshops that I was taking, but in my mind, I'm like, well, they don't need to be here. They've got to figure it out. And the difference that I noticed between those two different groups of people was like the amount of smile on their face. Like in terms of the trinkets, there are many better paying jobs where you're not working as hard to do in the world. And it felt like a
being
trap.
Self-employed does not come with the best benefits package.
Right. But yeah, always great conversations with these people who had really kind of stuck to their guns and were doing what they wanted to be doing in terms of what they're making. So I kept that in mind. And I also would see some in between where it was like people who were making something because they recognized that there was a good market for it and that it was a smart move, but also not tricking themselves into thinking that that was their work. It's like, if I can make this and it facilitates me being able to be a studio potter, then amazing, go for it. But once you start believing that that is your life's work, your creative outlet, then that's where I had seen it become a trap. And so the example I'll use for Hawaii is that I was doing this Celadon glazed tableware that had kind of like a very aqua blue-green Celadon with a mashiko slip, if you're familiar, just kind of like a reddish copper kind of accent glaze over the top of it. And it would kind of be in a net pattern that I would drizzle on there. And it was like a throw net over the ocean water was the idea. And I could not sell enough of those. Fortunately, there was some alignment with that whole line being something that I enjoyed and could really get behind. But it finally got to a point where it was like, okay, I am so finished making these and I could continue to have orders to this day, but I need to walk away from it. And that was hard because I definitely noticed it in my bank account, but it also felt like a trap. And so I've always been pretty reluctant on that front. And if I'm completely honest, I find myself in some ways in that kind of a trap right now, which, yeah, I don't really talk about that much publicly, but here we go. So, it's interesting because we're encouraged from a pretty early start of pursuing art to have something that's consistent and recognizable and unique. But then once you hold on to that for too long, then it's, oh, well, it's tired and played out and we've seen it before. With my work, with my carved work, I talk about it as like a glacial paste progression. I try to evolve my carving with every kiln load. And when I sell my pots, I'll pre-sell quite often my work with the understanding that it's artist choice on the carving pattern, because I don't want to be tied to tracking a specific pattern and filling a prescription. That just doesn't feel like it's that much fun to me.
That's also a huge recognition of the trust and the interest people have in your work specifically, to be like, cool, I'm good with that.
I trust what you're going to come to with. For the most part, has been just fine. I can think of one instance where the person was really rude and they probably were bringing other stuff to the equation, I'm sure. But, just like, well, this doesn't even come close to what I expected from you. And so I just said, I've just refunded your money on PayPal and I'd like you to send it back. Yeah. To which he then refunded me and said, no, I'll take care of it. So it became a little bit of a tit for tat kind of situation.
Something else going on.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think so.
Not always about us when it comes to customer service.
That's right. That's right. But actually speaking of customer service, that Four Seasons experience was really insightful in that way, because that is their brand,
Exactly.
is customer service. And so we would have these training sessions, and it was weird because we weren't quite employees.
Yeah, this is a fascinating thing that they have. Do they still do it?
Yeah, Artists of Maui, I think is what they're calling it at the Four Seasons Wailea. But yeah, and I have friends that were in the program when I was there all those years ago that are still going strong. And I mean, it's nothing else. I know when I was there, the hotel was taking 20% of the sale, which is great.
I was going to say, that does not feel bad to me.
Oh, not at all.
To not have to do any other marketing work to sell your work, to be that.
Yeah.
Man, no.
And to get all of the contact information, to get a mailing list from that.
They gave you a mailing list also?
You're actually doing the transaction. At the end, you write up the ticket, but you have your notebook and you take all of the contact information down and all of that. And
I shouldn't be asking about this when it's February in the Midwest. I'm like, so
right.
The hotel in Maui.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. But also, you get to see behind the scenes of all that too, which is an interesting experience. But anyways, yeah, I learned a whole lot about customer service. And, you might have noticed that I talked about the people at the hotel were clients or guests, because you don't ever call them customers. And we were primed.
I offer photography collections, not packages.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yep.
Oh, I was going to do the uncomfortable thing to pull back to the vulnerable bit, because the struggle I've always had with the conversations in school and now all the time on the podcast is that constant emphasis on finding your style, because it feels like such a pressure and a weight as someone who doesn't feel like she has that necessarily, but also that it's not exactly where, maybe this is going to sound weird, but here we go. I'm more interested in the craftsmanship side of it. Like, the idea of being a production potter doesn't necessarily bother me, because I wanted to see how good I can get at it. And maybe that's that classical music teaching. I don't know what it is, that yes, you want to be able to express yourself. But for me, like, there's a certain amount of satisfaction in the craftsmanship alone. It almost frees me of, if I have to match somebody else's, then it frees me of that mental weight, I guess. I don't know. I'm rambling now.
Yeah. And I think, some of how I think about that aspect, after Hawaii, the next move was to move closer to my then wife's family. We had our son at that point, and he had a bit of time between learning a solid grasp of English and starting kindergarten. So he was about 3.5 when we moved to Korea, which is where Hisu is from, so that he could get the language and get to know the family was a big part of that. And I, moving to Korea for a year was like, okay, what's the opportunity here? I had an opportunity to teach English for my brother-in-law.
I'm just thinking like Potter's dream of like, there's
Totally.
a huge tradition, and I did not expect English. Like, oh, I'm going to teach English. I was like, wait, what?
Yeah, that was like handed to me. Of my then brother-in-law had an English school in Seoul, and it was like, that would have been the easy job to take. But because we had saved money doing the 3 years of the Four Seasons program in Hawaii, I didn't necessarily need to have an income for the time that we were there, which is, an unbelievable opportunity. And so then it was like, okay, got to do an apprenticeship. And initially I thought, carved Celadon Korean pottery, like amazing. That's some of my favorite. But a year before we moved out there, we came for a visit to Korea and got to tour this studio that was making ongi, the traditional fermentation vessels that I now make. And I saw all the process of making these pots from coil and then paddling, and it was a kick wheel, and it was iron-rich clay, and all of these things were different than everything that all the techniques that I had used up to that point for making my pots. And so it became this decision of, do I dig deeper into something that I know a fair bit about already, or do I take that big turn and choose a technique that is way outside of my comfort level and jumping into vulnerability because there's just so much more to learn. And it kind of ties in with, like I said, when I was in my residency at the Bray, I was wanting to be in the classroom. When I was at that job in San Francisco, I was taking advantage of the money that my boss gave us to learn. And the philosophy that I've come to is that I know I have an idea of the pots that I want to make in my mind. And anytime we're trying to make something an object, I feel like there's a certain degree of resistance between the ideal image of what we have in our mind and what can actually physically be manifested. And the more of that craftsmanship side, that technical side that I spend my time doing, the less resistance there is between the ideas in my head and the execution of creating something with my hands. And so, for instance, there was an extreme difference between my ability to make the pots I wanted to before and after my time in Korea, because I gained so many more techniques from that because it was such a different approach, to where now if I'm working in porcelain, I can roll out a coil and pinch it onto the top of the porcelain pot if I don't have enough clay left. And before my apprenticeship, that would have never occurred to me. I guess that's all to say that's kind of how I approach this idea of personal identity in the work. I feel like most people have an idea of what their preferences are in terms of form and texture and color and design. And as much as I can get the technical stuff to become muscle memory, then it allows that to kind of shine through with a little bit less resistance. But the other side of it too that I'll mention is I'm somebody who, if we're on a road trip, I'll usually annoy definitely my kids, because if I see a shot, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to go back and I'm going to get that shot. And I've made an intentional practice of it in my day-to-day. And many people have used this term or this phrase, noticing what you notice, and being self-reflective of what's interesting. And so for me, a smartphone is a really great tool for that, because I can just quickly, with very low consequence, other than filling my phone with 20,000 photos, can have a record of the things that tickled my brain in a certain way of, oh, that's interesting. And then I can go back, and if I'm really intentional about reflecting on that, then I can say, oh, well, what is the thread of commonality between all of these images that I took in December of 2018? And it's formal qualities like color, composition, texture, all the stuff that I learned in Design 101 in college. I think it's a balance, is what I'm getting at, of being aware of those aesthetic elements and also getting some of those craftsmanship hurdles, if not getting them out of the way, kind of sanding them down a little bit so it's smoother, has been my approach.
The other thing I'm hearing, and this is going to sound so trite and cliche in many ways, but how much this making a living from the things you make is also in tandem with absolute lifelong learning.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
To keep the work fresh, to keep it selling, all of the logistical, very real concerns people have as far as livelihood goes, in many ways sounds like, from your experience, is wrapped up in exploring new things and being curious and pushing forward, even if it's not the most comfortable thing.
Yeah, definitely. And in listening to you say that, I think of a few people that I look to, they're like, man, they are just like having so much fun in their late career, making all kinds of different amazing work. I think about like Brad Miller. If you know his work at all, he's a ceramic artist and a sculptor and does a lot of 2D and stuff. But the way that he digs in with his curiosity as something that pulls him along is really inspirational. Yeah, I try. But, people like him, they're like doing so many different things. It's like, man, I don't know how he pulls it off.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of Brian Hopkins and I had a conversation, and he was saying the difference between being a full-time ceramicist and whatever other career is like, it's a lifestyle. It's not a job.
Yeah. Yep.
So much so.
Although it is a job too. And I think that's where, to kind of bring it a little closer to current time in this conversation, my business has grown kind of like a feral cat over the years in terms of business structure,
Yeah. We did talk about this a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Over like Instagram. Yeah.
And how it's just been very reactive. Oh, my business grew in this direction, so I better figure out a structure to support it. And then, oh, the market has pulled my business in this direction, so I better figure out a solution for that. And that's kind of Band-Aids on a dam that's bringing leaks, right? But that's all to say that my fiance, Jessie, is really great with planning ahead and putting structure in place. And like now it's Adamfield Pottery LLC, which feels pretty good to get that on track and just have a CPA and a bookkeeper and like just issued 1099s to people who've worked for me and all that good stuff.
These are the very important things. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have you tiptoed down the world of QuickBooks yet then when you issued those 1099s?
Yeah, the 1099s through QuickBooks, that's like magic.
Yep. This is the part where I nerd out, right? Because I think systems to me, most artistic colleagues of mine look at me like I have three heads when I start talking about systems because it feels constrictive. But to me, it's so freeing because I don't have to think about that stuff. I can literally open up an Office Manage system, log in the beginning of the day and be like, okay, here's what I have to do today. Boom. Rather than sit in front of the computer for 45 minutes going, what do I need to do? Oh, there's this email. Let me respond to that. Being in that reactive phase, right? It's just not. No, I sleep well at night.
It's
having
chaotic.
Nice little organized systems.
Yeah.
I know I'm pushing my luck here on how much time that you have probably.
No, you're fine.
Getting to the present day, what does life actually look like as far as either what your typical week is like and or also kind of what does keep the lights on? How does business work, if you will?
Yeah, I'm talking from, as I told you at the beginning of our conversation here, from our Airbnb apartment that is the top floor of my 3-story studio building. And so that has been something that we created a separate LLC for.
Look at you. You went from no LLCs to two. You're just all in. Like,
we're doing LLCs all day long.
You're like, that wasn't so bad. I can do this.
I know. Yeah, we can do that. And so that has been a great source of diversified income. We actually just had a 5-week long guest who left this morning. So that was great because she was very independent and was like, no, don't worry about any laundry or any of that for the bedding for 5 weeks. But outside of that, it's managing, turning it over for the next guests to come in. And I generally start my work day doing admin work at home. I feel like if I can clear that from my brain, that's helpful for me to come to the studio and be able to focus on my work in clay. I think things work pretty smoothly here if I have an assistant, but, add to the list of challenges brought by COVID, you'd have to be pretty lucky to find a decently affordable place in Helena right now. And I think it'd be really easy for me to put a call out on social media and say, hey, who wants to come and assist? I think a lot of people would respond, but then when it comes down to where are they going to stay, all the logisticals, that gets pretty difficult. And it's been a bit challenging, but still continuing to bring people through and have assistants that are kind of in that magic spot between being passionate about clay, but not so far along that they have their own like full-on career, so still wanting to learn and figure out the structure of a business. And that's worked out really well. Otherwise, I used to teach a lot of workshops. At the height of my workshop teaching years, I did 50 workshops in 2 years, and those were traveling workshops.
Ooh, I thought those were people coming to you, and that was a lot. Okay.
Yeah, traveling. And, I had it worked out to where it's like, okay, I can do a weekend workshop and find 2 colleges within decent driving distance and do a Friday at one and a Monday at the other one. And so that's how I would make it happen. And that was too much. I definitely explored the depths of how far was too far on that. And so knew that I needed to transition away from that. And so then it was, hosting workshops at my studio, which I was transitioning into for the 2 years ahead of COVID. And I ended up doing a big push to sell spots for 2 workshops in January and early February of 2000.
2020.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. You know what I meant. 2020. And
right when I was in Italy.
Oh.
Studying with Sandy Lockwood.
Oh, man. And so then it was like, all right, everybody, let's pump the brakes on this and we'll figure out what it's going to be. And then it became clear that it was going to be a while. But people were great in terms of, I just had credit for them to take a future workshop. But one person was like, hey, I am not anywhere that COVID is actually happening. I'm in the middle of nowhere and I kind of keep to myself. If I did all the precautions, could I come and work with you for a week? And at first I was like, oh, that sounds like a nightmare. And, the more I thought about it, I thought, well, if we don't structure it as a workshop where it's like, here are all the things that you're going to learn for the whole 8-hour day, as much as come and there'll be a demo in the morning and we can figure out how to steer my production ship in the direction that you're interested in going, but that it still continues and you look over my shoulder and you can ask questions. And he was totally on board. So he came, and 3 days into the 5-day session, he's like, I got to say, you need to offer this as a thing. He had taken a bunch of workshops for years prior, and he's just, this is so different and better than a lot of the workshop experiences I've had. By the end of it, I had shelves full of pots that I didn't have to leave to be bisque fired and to stay at a studio as part of their learning library, which is, a great thing to have. But just looking at the financials of it and the other aspects, I wasn't having to go away from my home and family for what ended up being a little bit less money than having somebody to come here. And so in so many ways, it's been great. And I've just started to book 1 week out of every month where somebody comes and does a shadow session. And it's been really good. So that's been, if we can call it, the COVID pivot. That was mine. And I've done almost no traveling in the last couple of years, and it feels really great and connective with my local community and family. So that's been really good. But yeah, trying to transition from pre-sales to having inventory has kind of been a big push for me.
Was there a reason that happened?
Just having a make list hanging over my head, things happen, pandemics happen, and difficulties with assistance happen in terms of sourcing and all that. So
supply chain.
Yeah. And I have found myself with some very late orders as a result, and that just doesn't feel good. And so if I can get caught up on those, which I'm happy to say I'm really close to right now, then just make the pots, box them up, and post them for sale. Seems like the way to go. Yeah, that's the latest direction here.
And just for the tactical obsession of mine, is your kind of making schedule now then that of the big make, shop update, ship them all, rinse and repeat?
That's the goal.
You have celebrities that call you up and really sidetrack things.
Well, to go back to the student union building at my college, I love that side of it, of just connecting with people and making these traditional fermentation jars and hearing these stories about which family member these are going to and how it's such an important thing for them to reconnect with their culture that kind of they strayed from in the move from Korea to the States. And now makgeolli, if you're familiar with that, is like a rice beer. It has become like one of the next cool things. And I'm like, that is so awesome. I mean, my children are half Korean. And if I can be a part of something that helps to bring visibility to that in the States and for them to have pride in their culture and their historical cultural heritage. That was one of the big things, because when I came back from Korea, I was like, I'm not Korean. I'm not in Korea. What is my place in making these fermentation jars? And that definitely was one of the things. I want to show my kids an example of what is valuable from their background. And what I noticed too is like, oh, this was like a really amazing, generous gift that my teachers shared with me in Korea. And I have the opportunity to share with a totally different audience that my teachers, because they're head down in the studio way out in the countryside in Korea, that story is not going to get spread too far beyond Korea. But those are some of the things that are kind of motivating for me in that direction.
I think that's fantastic. Yeah. Absolutely.
Some of the celebrity things, definitely they can sidetrack, but I am really careful to really stick to those dates on when orders have come in, because definitely the Seth Rogen thing got so much publicity, and because of the COVID delay, there were orders that were delayed, and had some people come to me and say, well, I know it looks like you're prioritizing this. And it's like, no, actually, I'm just sticking to the script. And this is something that's been under wraps and secret for such a long time that it seems like it's coming out of nowhere. But no, the date is king on my make list.
I think that's a really good point to make, because for so many creatives that aren't weirdos like me obsessed with systems, you have the shiny object syndrome where it's like, well, today I'm going to make this, or today I'm going to make, like when you don't have a little bit of structure, if you want to actually make a living from something and have people come back and buy something else, there has to be some, I don't know, I'm talking with my hands and nobody can see me. There's got to be some structure to be redundant.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And that is the funny thing too, when it comes to the mostly intended as a joke and we don't have to dive down the rabbit hole, but like, it's funny how long some things like a celebrity collaboration are actually going on before anybody ever knows about it, right? And how many things nobody sees in trying to make an opportunity like that come to fruition that, aren't sexy enough to make it to an Instagram feed.
Yeah. And in the case of some of these celebrities, like it, is a NDA that I've signed to where I can't talk about it. And that turns into more than a year, ahead of a project. And it was a good glimpse into, oh, this is the world that they live in, where everything kind of has to be a big secret and stuff.
He says with such joy.
No, really. It's weird. It also is like a glimpse into...
It's just a totally different world, I feel like.
Just the strangeness of the whole Hollywood scene of like, okay, a big part of this career path is keeping secrets, which aren't very healthy things to keep.
Yeah. Well, to completely left turn away from that, because I have no segue whatsoever.
Yeah.
Just big open-ended question. Is there anything you feel like we haven't talked about that for people who have had their first experience in clay, are getting obsessed with it like all of us do, and are trying to figure out, is this an option? Can I make a living from what I make? Any Adam Field wisdom, that departing thoughts that you feel like we haven't touched on?
Yeah, it's been something that's been on my mind actually this morning. I booked this really sweet shadow session, which this is the second time that it's happened, but it's parents saying, my high school student is about to graduate and is really into clay and is very mature and is somebody who would be fine to travel on his own. But he's wanting to, in this case, finish high school and have a career in clay. And they're like, we want to gift him this session for a week with you. And I'm like, oh man, that's amazing. For one, great parent.
Coolest graduation present ever.
Serious. And then I'm like, okay, well, this is like big responsibility on my part. What do you try to impart in somebody who is setting out from a very early part of this? And what's come for me to that is that, I looked at his Instagram and he has really great foundational skills and some really interesting ideas happening on the aesthetics. But it's like, those are the things that I'm really thinking about. And sure, the business side is important, and he'll be able to see some of that while he's here. But it's okay, how can I impart that side of things that is more about the experience of making pots than necessarily that end piece of the finished pots? That's a terrible thing to explore in terms of sales of, I thought about that because the whole Four Seasons thing, if I was down there just talking about how, really the important part about making pots for me is the making and not necessarily these byproducts that are the finished product.
Oh, you want that?
Oh yeah, you're going to pay me. Okay, fine. But I really do think that that is such an important part to kind of have this long-term excitement for continuing to make pots and to grow in the directions that you find interesting, because it can be a trap otherwise. And I know that's kind of vague in a way, but hopefully it will connect for people in a way that is meaningful for them to hear.
And I think I'm just going to leave it at that. There's thoughts in my head, but I just want people to make of it whatever they're going to make of it, and we'll see what happens. If people don't know, for some strange reason, where to come and check out all of the work that you're doing, where should we send them on the internet?
Yeah, I tried to make it real simple. So it's Adam Field Pottery. And that applies for my website, for my Instagram, are the main two platforms. You can link to my YouTube videos through my website. And I figured since I was making the content anyways, I might as well drop it onto TikTok. So you can find me on there too.
Next up, dancing.
Oh, yeah. I do some serious dance moves on there. Not really. But I tell you, that has actually become, because it was really easy to discount it. But every once in a while, it's kind of flipped through TikTok. And there's something, obviously, it's like a very successful platform. Mm-hmm. But I feel like there's a lot to actually learn on there. For whatever reason, the content that I'm drawn to is like I'm learning a ton about cooking. I'm learning a lot about some of the things that I really didn't expect. There's a guy who documents his father who is pretty far along with Alzheimer's. And it's amazing. It's this opportunity for the world to kind of see what that looks like, because we know that it's a really difficult thing, but a lot of us don't really know what that looks like. Mm-hmm. And to go back to that person, and not that I'm holding any kind of grudge because I know where he was coming from, but that person that asked me how much time I spend on social media versus making pots at that panel discussion at NCCA, I really look at a lot of these social media platforms in the same way that I would look at a fresh box of clay. And at the point that it's a fresh box of clay, it's pretty useful as a doorstop and maybe a few other things, but not too much more. And it really depends on what we do with it as to what the function is. And so when I hear criticism about content on social media, I think there are a lot of people making some pretty questionably poor objects that are really good at social media. And I think that's one of the big injustices that you hear people kind of crying out about. And I see it, of course, in the clay field. And there was a certain point where I was like, I don't think you get to complain unless you're doing something to change that, even if it's a little thing. And so that's where it's okay. I enjoy the marketing side enough. And I think that there are some bad directions that it's going. So I'm going to, sorry to pull like a Gandhi move here, but like be the change that you want to see, right?
It's kind of like that Brene Brown quote about criticism. Like, I only want to hear your critique if you're also in the ring.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
Like you've got to equally be doing the work to give me feedback on the work.
Yeah, you can't just sit back with the remote and your popcorn and be like, oh, you should change that.
We can. It's very easy.
It's very comfortable.
Right. But we're not going to respond to you.
That's right. You're not a relevant contributor to the conversation.
Well, as has been the case for so much, I really just want to get on a flight and come shadow for a week now after this conversation. It's been fantastic, and there's so many more conversations I want to have from it. So we might have to hitch up for round 2.
Yeah, that'd be great. I know. I feel like there's a lot more to talk about. And want to mention too, if I imagine people after listening to this would be like, well, how do the shadow sessions work? And just send me an email. I book out in advance on those, but just reach out.
Awesome. Perfect. And with that, we kick off season 3, making this episode 301 on the Maker's Playbook podcast. My friends, we have some really big things in store with our little slice of the internet here. You've heard me end every single episode for the last 15 months worth of podcasts now with the belief that together we can really make these crazy, audacious dreams of our maker's life actually work. And I firmly believe that. My photography business is proof of the importance of having a community of peers around you to lean on and discuss so many of the issues and questions that come up not only in our making, but in the creation of small businesses and this whole unexpected approach to life. There's not too many handbooks on this. But ending a podcast with that has always felt a little one-sided. And while yes, I've received so many heartwarming, encouraging emails from all of you about this podcast, I've always wished that those emails weren't just private to me, that they weren't just one-on-one conversations. I've wanted to be able to share so many of those chats with our makers community at large, which is exactly why in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be launching an online community platform. Holy cow. I just said it out loud. So as soon as I hit end on this recording, I will be digging right back into the technology troubleshooting that I am going through to make sure that this platform actually launches. But until then, let me be clear. I'm not talking about a Facebook group here, my friends. That would be easy and take me 2 seconds. And it would also be really distracting and not very helpful, at least in my experience of Facebook groups. What I'm talking about is a specific, niche place online for us as a community of ceramicists and makers to have a safe space to share and discuss the wide array of subjects and questions that we all have. From needing photography help, to Instagram marketing questions, to sharing our shop updates and asking about where a friend sources those gorgeous, rich iron clays that you see them use online. It's all going to be easy to find and discuss together in this community. Now, I don't quite have everything figured out yet, so if you want to be sure to not miss out on joining us when this does launch, then be sure to hop over to makersplaybook.com/newsletter as soon as you wipe the mud off your hands and join our insiders email list. I'll be opening up the community first to the people in our email list, and I am working on a special little bonus for the first people that sign up, so you aren't going to want to miss out. Once again, that's makersplaybook.com/newsletter. Or you can just click the link in the show notes of this episode on whatever podcast player app that you're using to listen. It feels so great to be back and sharing new conversations with all of you. So, as always, until next week, go get back to making your dreams a reality, because together, we've got this.